Shortall. Taoiseach, we all know that the cost of living is out of control. Inflation is now almost at 10% and prices right across the economy are soaring. On Friday, Electric Ireland hiked their prices for the second time in just 3 months, adding a further €350 to the cost of gas and €164 to the cost of electricity. Other providers will undoubtedly follow suit. Families who are already struggling to pay their bills and put food on the table are also having to cope with the huge cost of back to school, up to €1,500 per child. Taoiseach, where do you think those families will get the money for back to school? Because it's not coming from the state. The back to school allowance was actually more in 2007, 15 years ago, than it is now. That's really pathetic, Taoiseach. Is it any wonder then that last year almost 1 in 4 families went into debt to pay back to school costs? This year the figure is likely to be significantly higher than that. And why is that? Because the government is refusing to help. Taoiseach, you and your cabinet colleagues have acknowledged that ordinary workers and families are under immense pressure at the moment. You've also said that exceptional measures, in addition to the budgetary measures, will have to be taken to assist them. However, when he announced the summer economic statement yesterday, Minister McGrath said that once-off exceptional measures would not be announced until the September budget. That's 3 months away. That delay will guarantee one thing, Taoiseach: more and more people who are barely scraping by at the moment will fall into poverty and debt. Why are you waiting? Is it because you've run out of ideas, or is it because of division within government? We know that there is disagreement in government about whether you should introduce another universal electricity credit. Is that the reason you're refusing to act now? Wrangling behind the scenes about the nature of the measures that will be introduced. We heard a lot about listening to the experts during COVID, but the budgetary advice that you're getting now appears to have fallen on deaf ears over recent weeks. You're not listening to the experts, Taoiseach, like the SRI, who say the government has the capacity to introduce targeted measures now, and critically, they must be targeted at those families most in need. Taoiseach, it is truly unforgivable that the government is about to swan off on its holidays when the Dáil goes into recess. Recess for 2 months, in the knowledge that so many people are in dire need of assistance. So, Taoiseach, will you reconsider and do the right thing? Will you introduce an emergency budget now, before it's too late for so many families?
Thanks. Thanks very much, Deputy. Once again, I want to acknowledge on behalf of the government that we recognise that back to school is a very expensive time for families and puts a lot of pressure on family budgets, as is the case when it comes to back to college as well. The government is responding. The back to school clothing and footwear allowance will be paid from next week. There is an increase to €160 for children aged 4 to 11 and to €285 for children aged 12 years and older. There's an increase in the third level grant, the SUSI grant, which kicks in September, and we've also made changes to make more people eligible for that grant and to allow students to earn more over the summer without it affecting their grant next year. But as I mentioned earlier, government accepts that when we announced the increase in the back to school clothing and footwear allowance back in January, we did not anticipate that inflation would be as high as it is now. Our projections were for inflation of maybe only 2 or 3%, and now it's closer to 10%. So precisely for that reason, Minister Foley, Minister Humphreys, Minister McGrath have been in discussions yesterday and today at the request of the Taoiseach, Minister Roisin and I, to see if they can come up with some measures to enhance supports available to families when it comes to back to school. And we do acknowledge that end of September is too late in that regard. And that work is being done at the moment.
Excuse me. Taoiseach, I don't know if you realise how difficult it is for low-income families. The St Vincent de Paul, for example, are really concerned about the summer holidays because they don't know what's going to happen to those families that are utterly dependent on breakfast clubs and school meals. So where is the food going to come from during the summer holidays? What will happen when parents just can't afford food, when they can't afford school uniforms, shoes for going back to school, books? You talk about looking at this again. There's an enormous catch-up required in order to bring the back-to-school allowance anywhere close to what is required. How will parents cope when they get a request for a so-called voluntary contribution because the state refuses to adequately fund all our schools? Tánaiste, we need answers to these questions now. Poor families need answers to these questions now. They can't wait 3 months.
Thanks, Deputy. I understand it very well. The Hot School Meals programme, which is working extremely well, was introduced by my colleague, Regina Doherty, when she was Minister for Social Protection. The back-to-school clothing and footwear allowance is being increased by Minister Humphreys, who is the Minister for Social Protection at the moment. Minister Joe McHugh, the former Minister for Education, introduced the grant to encourage school books rental schemes and extended that to all DEIS schools. So we understand it very well. The cost of going back to school is a very high cost for families. That isn't something new. That's been the case for years. We were working on it then. Under this government, we're working on it now. And Minister Foley in particular is putting a lot of efforts into discussions today and yesterday with Minister Humphreys and Minister McGrath to see if there's more we can do in addition to what's already committed to. An increase in the back-to-school clothing footwear allowance kicking in next week, an increase in the SUSI grant for third level kicking in the next few weeks. But we acknowledge that when those decisions were made back last year, inflation was not anticipated to be as high as it is now. And we also acknowledge that waiting until September is too late, specifically when it relates to back to school and back to college.